Hello, I'm Jennifer Warren, and we are speaking today on the platform More Than Elemental, which is focused on trends in energy, innovation, economic developments, and also trends to do with AI and its infrastructure. And today I have with me Ian Taylor, the CEO of SymbiChain. And we actually met at a blockchain summit back in November of 2023 in Fort Worth. And a lot has happened since then, which we'll get to. But can you just, thanks for being here. And also,
Mhm.
can you tell me a little bit about the origins of Simba Chain?
Yeah, sure. So back in 2016, I was a professor at the University of Notre Dame, and a local company contacted the university and wanted to submit something on blockchain. It was a DARPA call. It was about securing messaging using blockchain. So I wrote a proposal. It was called Secure Messaging Using Blockchain Architecture, Simba. And that's kind of how Simba started. And then we formed a company late 2017. Since then, it's never it's never been a straight path, but we still kind of stick to the blockchain in part, but most of our solution really is in the upper layers now. So we have a layer of verifiability, which we focus on supply chains and bringing trust into supply chains,
Mm.
which is a theme we'll talk about
Yeah.
today. But with that in mind, we have that layer of trust with the blockchain, but then we have the verifiability using standards such as decentralized identities and verifiable credentials. And then we take all of that data and rewire it back together again so you can use the resulting data in a way that's intuitive to folks. So we use knowledge graphs for that. And all that means, relational databases are to query the entire database, you have to join all the tables together. So it's quite complicated. A graph database focuses on relationships between data, and you build those relationships up across the data, and you can query the whole thing in one query. So you can ask all sorts of supply chain questions like, where did the raw material come from? Or, what's the lead time of the sub-tier suppliers for this particular part and so forth. So we started off with the DoD. And more recently, which in the DoD, they require, full verifiability, where did the part come from? Who
Right.
touched it? All of that stuff. So we provide that full trail of provenance and verifiability. And then more recently, we've taken that to the commercial realm, and
Mhm.
we're applying that against batteries. So
Right. Yeah. So yeah, much has happened, since we met, and then I know we've talked a little bit about, your supply chain work and DoD and that sort of thing. But with your work in supply chains, how are you translating those capabilities into battery supply chains?
yeah, so I mean, for for the DoD or DOW, we've been essentially bringing in data from supply chains and securing that data, making it permissionable. So different stakeholders have different permissions to the data, and then kind of re-engineering that or reimagining that to into this format where they can ask questions of the data. And it's very similar in battery supply chains. Battery supply chains are complex too,
Mhm.
and they have different the international supply chains. They have different parts coming from different countries. Raw materials come from different places. So it's a very kind of complex thing, and there's a lot of regulations surrounding that industry. So it was fairly straightforward to transition from what we're doing in the Air Force to the battery space because it goes through the same process. You have multiple sources of information. We bring that data together, we secure that and secure the verifiability of that data. And then we permission that data so that different stakeholders involved in regulation or in, the commercial side of things can see the data that they, want to see and not more data. So it's a very similar process. And at the end of the day, you have the data in a usable format so you can ask questions of that data, whether it be pull the data to meet a specific regulation or, optimizing your supply chain or batteries, for example, give me all of the state of all of the batteries that are in my data center, for example.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
then,
So we we'd mentioned before that, there's sort of an example, like if you had to, your battery passport idea is sort of tracking the supply chains, like where it
Mhm.
comes from, like the critical minerals that come from, the Democratic Republic of Congo or whatever. You can do that kind of, that's what that gets at, right? Um,
Yeah, so the concept of the Samba passport is really it's similar to some of the regulations around the world, but the way we think of it is a full verifiability from the production of a battery, for example, and even tests that have been done on the battery before it's actually sold to somebody. That's a kind of an important piece as well. But it's not just the battery itself and the components of the battery where the raw materials and so forth come from. That is kind of captured in standards, let's say.
mhm,
But it's also about capturing data along the continuum, along the entire life cycle. So, think of Carfax, think of, full service history for a car, for example. If you have that, then it's more valuable than if you don't have that. So, having that value chain, having that kind of capturing that full service history for a battery, including kind of when its first life ends, and maybe it's resold to another entity,
mhm.
capturing that too. So track it through its first life, its second life, and so forth, as the battery is being used.
So this is pretty novel what you're doing. I mean, is anybody else really doing, tracking the supply chain of, the full, like you said, value chain of batteries? This is fairly novel, right?
I think that that there are companies certainly that focus on the regulation side of this. For example, the digital product passport in the EU,
Hmm.
there's companies there's many companies that are in that market. I think that, the novelty that we've thought, that we kind of the space we're in really is the intersection of, okay, the regulation is part of the puzzle, but it's having that kind of being able to augment that passport with new data as the battery kind of goes through its lifetime. I think
Right.
that is something that I think we have a comprehensive solution to that to be able to, for example, define new types of information that comes into the battery kind of life cycle.
Hmm.
We're very flexible in the way that we can define those and bring them in. So we
Right.
are a little bit unique in that aspect, but there are a lot of companies in the supply chain space,
Hmm.
obviously,
Yeah,
more
yeah.
generally. So we try and focus on the niche kind of
Right.
space.
We'd also talked about there's these regulations, digital passports that are coming in Europe and where you have to trace the supply chains of certain kinds of products, and
Yeah.
batteries is one of them. So, can you just discuss a little bit about that, the Europe scene just in general, and then I know that you mentioned too that this is also coming to the United States in its own way.
Yeah, I mean they're quite different. So in Europe, they have the digital product passport regulation for batteries. Batteries is actually the first product that
Hmm.
is going to be regulated. That starts in February 27.
Okay.
And if you think about kind of what that means, if you take your mobile phone and scan a QR code on a battery, you get information about that battery, not the product, but that specific battery as it goes through its lifetime, for example. So in the way that European standard has about, well, it used to have 93 data points. Now it has 99, but that's quite comprehensive over 7 different categories. It goes through kind of the product specifications, different aspects about the raw materials involved in it. It also has environmental impact, like the CO2 to create the batteries, and then supply chain due diligence, which really kind of goes into the supply chain too and assesses that impact. So it's
Mhm.
quite a comprehensive standard for collecting information about batteries. And that, like I said, that has to be, every battery sold into the EU has to have a passport by February 27, or they can't sell the battery.
Right. And then what is happening in the United States? What's kind of,
So United States are much less not comprehensive, but less regulatory than
yeah.
that. So they've gone for a more lightweight approach. So and the standard that that is out there right now is the SAE uh, J 3327, and that is a standard that is based on the digital product passport. So they took what the EU were doing, and they tried to remove everything that would cause friction in
Hmm.
the US. So they tried to promote things like, full life cycle, right? But they didn't include, supply chain due diligence to some degree, the CO2 aspects and things like that.
Uh-huh.
They, had a very focused, so instead of the, 99 parameters that you
Yeah.
have to collect in the EU, which go across, which some of those are really complicated to
Yeah.
calculate. They've cut that down to similar number of categories, but it's only 27 parameters.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
this is kind of this is a way of being able to engage with industry. So they've talked to industry extensively about what industry think they could collect on behalf of themselves as OEMs and the suppliers that
Yeah.
feed. And they've come to this standard, which is very interesting. And not only are they trying to, it isn't a standard, it isn't mandatory, it's optional right now, but they're going through a process of hardening this year, getting engagement from industry to implement this standard. And then there's also a related activity which came out in the NDAA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, which came out beginning of December on the 10th, I believe. And in that Defense Act, they specified that by January 2028, you have to have traceability within batteries that are being supplied to the DoD.
Hmm.
Now, it's reasonable to think that J20 3327 is going to be the traceability standard for that or something based on that. And they are working on that this year. So it might be that this is a general way for commercial traceability and for the DoD traceability. Now, the other aspect of this for the commercial side is that if you meet this standard,
Yeah.
there's also that kind of checks the box for the tax credits you might be able to get as well. So there's an incentive in terms of tax credits for meeting these standards as
Hmm.
well.
Hmm. So, so you mentioned sort of what's happening on the regulatory front in the United States. We also discussed, just kind of bringing it down to, some applications that are happening with batteries. We discussed that there's an increased need for battery energy storage systems, BESS, with
Right.
newer data centers coming online, and that the grids are not really geared to handle the spikes that happen with training runs. It spikes up and then it kind of
Yeah.
it goes down into a big valley. So how would the work that you're doing play a role in batteries in the future?
Yeah, so maybe just say a bit about, expand on what you've touched on there. So, data centers now are kind of a mix of, CPUs, GPUs, mixed purposes, and so forth. It seems like that there was a massive uh, there was a lot of conversations and working groups within NatBat, which is the National North American Association for the Batteries. That in terms of what was said at that meeting, and there was keynotes to this effect that the scale of these data centers, they're almost going to be kind of converting from data centers to AI factories.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they're going from
Yeah.
GPU based,
Yeah.
to completely GPU,
Right.
higher intensivity. You're going from hundreds of megawatts to gigawatts of
Right.
power
Right.
that needs to be consumed. And if you're talking about AI, there is, in the training phase of AI, that's when the energy is needed the most. So, when an AI starts training, you can imagine it's really the power consumption of a small city
Right. Right.
equivalent, and then it stops. So in a millisecond, that power just goes to, drops off completely.
Right.
So if that happened in the grid now, it wouldn't be able to handle that kind of shift in load. So there are certain states that are looking at kind of working with data centers to provide a smoothing effect
Hmm.
that kind of massive gap doesn't
Right.
happen.
Right.
And that's where the BESS, the battery energy storage systems, come in, right? So instead of sort of when the AI starts training, instead of consuming all of that power from the grid, batteries will come into play.
Hmm.
And, with that scenario, you're talking about really powerful batteries and data centers.
Yeah.
They are taking a hell of a lot of load.
Yeah.
This is kind of, they're being really put through the paces. They're being used in ways that they wouldn't be used, haven't been used previously.
Yeah.
There's, estimates around, every 3 to 5 years,
Hmm.
you're going to have to replace batteries completely in data centers because, as any battery, like my iPhone now is at 79% of the original, that's going to happen with these large batteries in data centers. So every 3 to 5 years, data centers are going to have to replace the batteries, which is around $200,000 to $300,000. It's a
Uh-huh.
big
Hmm.
expense, and it needs to be understood. So our role in that is to really extend this concept of the battery passport. So we're representing the individual batteries, but we're also augmenting that with the health of the battery and other factors that would determine decision making and when that decision making might happen. So they'll be able to get ahead of the game and understand when the batteries might need replacing, but also because we have the not only the health of the battery being recorded, but we have the state of the battery when it was first installed. So
Right.
you have a full service history of the
Right.
battery. And
Right.
then when you come to take those batteries out and replace them with new batteries, the resale value of those, like any full service history item, like a car or anything else, the value is much higher. So you could offset that capex by selling those batteries to other uses.
Right.
And they might not be suitable for data centers, which are an extreme use, but they could last for 20 years in another use. So
Right.
the value of those batteries is still very high, but you need that verifiability to prove it.
Yeah, so it creates a secondary market for batteries. And some of the batteries that you're talking about, I mean, what are the sizes? I mean, are they, what size kilowatt batteries are we talking about that are being sort of strung together? Do you know?
Some of the BESs are like 6 kilowatts.
Uh-huh. Hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm
Like the whole system or just individual battery?
no individual batteries,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
they're
and
larger
strung
batteries.
together. Yeah, yeah,
So,
to
so the normal, lithium-ion batteries last maybe 3 to 5 thousand cycles. These larger batteries last 5 to 10,000 cycles, so they're designed to take that load, but they're much higher kilowatt, rating basically.
right,
To and there's a whole new sort of set of these batteries that are being released and being used in the in for the data center market that they
right.
expect coming, which incidentally is in terms of the expense over the next few years, they're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars being invested in this data center space. So
Oh
it's a
yeah, no, the CapEx this year is like just the top hyperscalers. It's over 600 billion,
yeah,
the CapEx numbers for 2026 in total. Of course, a lot of that, as we know, is our GPUs and CPUs and things like that. That's the bulk of it. But, building the power systems connected to it, it's increasingly important because there's the speed to market and batteries are one solution, to get that happening. And
right.
and I'm kind of doing a lot of work in that space of how we're going to meet this power demand. So this plays a part in that as well, especially as these data centers densify further the compute. So it is really, really going to be interesting to watch this, and see who's doing what and their approaches because they're all very, they're different, just getting their data centers stood up so that they can run, the infrastructure and monetize. So I just was going to ask you one quick wild card question.
Oh.
And that is just, just in a real general way, like in what way are you using AI in what you do? How are you applying it?
So we're focused on using AI for data.
Mhm.
Specifically, we're working with the University of Notre Dame on this, but taking unstructured, semi-structured data on the input and creating a fully structured format on the output. So going from unstructured data to a graph format, basically.
Mhm. Mhm.
And the way that works generally is most folks use retrieval augmented generation RAG approach, but the problem with that is that you're representing the input data as a point in this multi-dimensional vector space, and you're measuring the distance between them. So it's highly dependent on how you represent that, you know, point and whether that is sufficient. Often it's not sufficient. It's been shown not to be sufficient, and even so-called graph RAG approaches use the same notion. So they use that similarity difference to create the graph. So we take a totally different approach. So our approach is more to do with using LLMs to look at the data and extract the relationships that exist in the data. So they
Mhm.
create that, and then they map those relationships to known dictionaries or ontologies from W3C and the rest of them. And then when there's a relationship that can't be mapped to the known relationships that are out there, we create what we call as a synthetic ontology or synthetic relationship. So in a sense, those synthetic pieces fill in the gaps that
Mhm.
the normal ontologies can't cope, can't represent.
Mhm.
So that means that, we get a fully rich representation in the graph database of the data and the relationships, and we can query that. And you can think of that like, you can almost untangle, what is conventionally like a black box system, like AI, for example. You could take the data and you can kind of untangle that in a way where when you ask a question of that data in the graph side of things, you know exactly why the graph is answering that question in the way that you're getting the answer, because you can go into the graph and understand what the data is and why that question is being answered the way it is.
Mhm.
So we're working on that in the same theme as trust and transparency and verifiability. We're
Right.
kind of using that approach in AI.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, would you say just in general, I mean, because I mean everyone like throws around, using data and, data's king and there's so much data, right? And there's so many firms trying to,
Right.
show firms how to deal with their data, whether it's, small language models, using large language models, all these things, all these tools. And so in your instance, would you say that your approach is, you know, domain specific or are you just coming up with an approach with data that makes sense with how data is produced? I mean, do you have any color on what your approach is getting at in a simple way?
Yeah, so it depends what people are after, right? So if they're after a solution and not really, having the need to verify, if you want to ingest a bunch of files with an LLM, for example, and then have answers, and
Yeah.
those answers are good enough and they seem right to you, then that's one mechanism, and that's a really quick mechanism of ingesting a bunch of data and getting some answers. But
Right.
there is a component of that approach that you could get hallucinations, for example.
Yeah.
With the approach we take, there's no hallucinations because you have full transparency on the answers that you get. So it's
Mhm.
much, it's a much more, I guess, trusted approach
Right.
and verifiable approach than using LLMs directly. So that's kind of where we're going with that.
Right. Yeah, so you're adding another layer, another step to make it
Yeah.
the data trustworthy, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, and transparent, right? So
Right. So that yeah, it's verifiable. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, brilliant. Well, thanks for your time, and it's going to be really interesting to see how these standards develop in the United States. And it sounds like with what you're doing with the battery supply chain, it's going to be a market that can be, there will be known, it's going to be transparency in pricing too at some point, right? I mean, which
yeah.
is, you know, good.
Yeah, it's a very interesting time to be in this space while it's exploding, right?
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
talking the next 20x growth for the next few years, so it's very fascinating time, and yeah,
No, I know.
looking forward to being a part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Cheers.